The morning my world shifted. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of our penthouse, casting sharp beams across the marble floor. I stood with my coffee untouched, watching my husband adjust his tie with the same confidence he wore when sealing billion-dollar deals. 7 years of supporting him, 7 years of investing my family's fortune into his dream, and all I got was a sentence that sliced through me like glass. "I'm promoting Vanessa," he said casually, naming the 23-year-old woman everyone whispered about in hushed corners. He didn't even look at me as he spoke, as though I was just another assistant meant to nod and vanish. Before I continue narrating the story of Claire, please consider giving this video a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel. I forced myself not to tremble, not to let him see the storm boiling under my skin. He called it a strategic move, claiming her fresh perspective would revolutionize the empire I had quietly financed from behind the scenes. My reflection in the mirror behind him looked foreign, calm, poised, but hollow-eyed with betrayal. He had no idea that every institutional investor he bragged about in glossy interviews was simply another channel of my family's capital. The audacity of his words, "Nothing personal, Claire, it's just business," ignited a fire I hadn't felt in years. When the door shut behind his Tesla, silence pressed against me like a weight. I walked into my private office and unlocked my laptop, my fingers steady though my heart hammered. 14 accounts opened across my screen, each one feeding the lifeblood of his empire. He thought he owned everything, but in truth, he was a guest, perched precariously on a fortune spanning 3 generations of Whitmans. With one decision, I realized, I could tilt his glass tower until it shattered. The betrayal hadn't been sudden. It had grown like mold I pretended not to see. The unexplained charges, the late nights, the consulting invoices for Vanessa's firm, all hints I had ignored. His assistant, Nina, had tried to warn me, sliding subtle clues my way in quiet conversations. Now I scrolled through months of approvals, Daniel's signature authorizing $600,000 to Vanessa's so-called consulting group. It was more than betrayal. It was theft disguised as strategy. I dialed Nina, my voice, even though I felt the edges of fury sharpen in my chest. "Forward me everything with Vanessa's name on it," I instructed, and though she hesitated, she obeyed within 20 minutes. My inbox overflowed with invoices, receipts, emails, proof of the siphoning I had suspected but never confirmed. I read line after line, each one pulling me further from shock into something colder. This wasn't just about replacing me, it was about erasing me. My sister, Eleanor, answered on the first ring when I called. She expected small talk, but I cut straight to the truth. "He gave my position to his mistress," I said, and her silence stretched long enough for me to hear her controlled breathing. Then, in a voice as sharp as the gavel she used in court, she said, "I'm coming over. Don't you dare make a move until I arrive." But waiting felt impossible. My father had always said liquidity was freedom, and he ensured every trust and fund had clauses that allowed for immediate withdrawal. I pulled up contracts I had memorized years ago, their wording granting me ironclad power. My finger hovered over the first draft withdrawal notice, a document that could topple Daniel's kingdom in under 24 hours. I didn't send it yet, but writing it out gave me a strange calm. A knock at the door snapped me back to the present. Eleanor entered briskly, tossing her briefcase onto the sofa as though preparing for trial. She scanned the documents on my screen, her frown deepening with each passing second. "Claire," she whispered, her voice low with rage, "you built this empire. Every signature here is yours." Her hands squeezed mine tightly, and in that moment I wasn't just a wife scorned. I was an architect betrayed. I thought about my mother and grandmother, women who had managed fortunes while their husbands enjoyed the credit. History was repeating itself, and I was tired of playing silent benefactor. Daniel had strutted on magazine covers calling himself a visionary, while I was the shadow that kept him from collapsing. My pulse slowed as clarity settled in. He thought he had replaced me, but he had only awakened me. That evening, I prepared dinner as though nothing had changed. Salmon and roasted asparagus, Emma's favorite, my 12-year-old daughter who knew far too much for her age. She chatted about her violin recital while I nodded, storing rage in quiet compartments of my mind. Daniel texted that he'd be late. Again. But I no longer cared. Each second he spent away only solidified the plans I was shaping. After Emma went to bed, I poured myself a glass of wine and opened a blank spreadsheet. 14 accounts lined in careful order, percentages and withdrawal clauses mapped with surgical precision. It wasn't just numbers. It was power, leverage, justice. I stared at our wedding photo beside my computer, the smile on my father's face suddenly layered with warning I had ignored. "Protect yourself," he had whispered that day, and now I finally understood why. Sleep never came that night. I lay awake listening to Daniel's eventual return, the muffled sound of his laughter over a phone call I didn't dare interrupt. My hands clenched around the sheets, but I stayed silent, memorizing the rhythm of his betrayal. Every choice he made tightened the noose he didn't even know existed. I wasn't powerless. I was preparing for war. The gala the next evening sparkled with champagne, diamonds, and the hollow smiles of the wealthy. Daniel worked the room with Vanessa at his side, introducing her as his brilliant consultant. I wore the burgundy gown he had chosen, the one he liked for photographs, and smiled like the perfect wife. But inside, every polite laugh was another nail hammered into the coffin of our marriage. When Vanessa held Daniel's coffee cup without him asking, I knew the intimacy wasn't new. It was practiced. She approached me with a smile that didn't touch her green eyes. "Claire, Daniel speaks so highly of your support," she said, the word cutting deeper than any insult. "Not partnership, not contribution, support." I extended my hand, steady, and replied, "I look forward to seeing your consulting work." The room sparkled with applause when Daniel praised her innovative insights. I sipped my champagne slowly, every bubble a reminder of the empire she thought she was joining. Around us, investors congratulated her, blind to the truth that their fortunes weren't tied to Daniel's charisma, but to my family's wealth. My stomach twisted, but not with grief, with anticipation. They had no idea the floor beneath them was already cracking. When I returned home that night, Emma's drawing sat on the counter, a family portrait with me, her, and Daniel holding hands. Vanessa wasn't there, though Emma had already met her once by accident. The innocence of those colored lines nearly broke me, but I refused to cry. Instead, I folded the picture neatly and placed it inside my desk drawer, a silent reminder of who I was fighting for. Betrayal had stolen my marriage, but it would not steal my daughter's future. The next morning, I waited until Daniel left for his office before calling Eleanor again. She was already halfway through reviewing our family's legal trust documents, her voice crisp and purposeful. "Claire, you have full withdrawal authority on 12 of the accounts," she said, tapping her keyboard as if hunting prey. "The other 2 are managed through shell firms, but both are under your legal control as trustee." My heart pounded with something dangerous, relief mixed with righteous fury. I hung up and immediately dialed Spencer, my mother's former financial advisor, who now worked exclusively for our family's private holdings. Spencer had always liked me better than Daniel, though he never said so outright. When I explained the situation, his tone shifted from professional to protective. "Send me the paperwork," he said. "I'll have the liquidity ready within 48 hours. By noon, I was on a call with Richard Crane, CFO of Daniel's company and a man I had known since he took the job 4 years ago. He answered warily, perhaps already sensing the storm beneath my calm voice. "Richard," I began, "I'm withdrawing the entirety of the Whitman investments." There was a sharp inhale on the other end, then silence. "That's over half of our operating capital, Claire." "Yes," I said plainly, 58% to be exact, spread across 14 discrete channels. He didn't argue. He knew the truth. My money, masked as diverse venture support, had been the skeleton holding the body of Daniel's empire upright. Richard cleared his throat and asked if he should inform the board. "No," I replied, my voice like ice. "Not yet." Timing would be everything, and this knife would cut deepest in silence. After the call, I took Emma to her violin lesson, smiling through parent small talk and suppressing the 1,000 thoughts racing through my head. She played beautifully, her brows furrowed in concentration, the same way her father looked at quarterly reports. But unlike Daniel, Emma's talent wasn't a performance for praise. It was hers alone. I thought about the house Vanessa had been viewing in Connecticut, the one Daniel had shown me a decade ago as our dream home. Now it was being repurposed for someone who didn't know the difference between a ledger and a loan covenant. Back home, I found Daniel's assistant Nina sitting nervously in my living room. She'd texted saying she had something I deserved to see, and I'd told her to come quietly. Her hands trembled as she handed me a thick folder bound in a red silk ribbon, Daniel's favorite shade, ironically. Inside were photos, texts, flight confirmations, and hotel invoices, all proving that Daniel's affair with Vanessa had started over a year ago. "He told her you were just an investor," Nina whispered, "not his wife." That lie burned more than the betrayal itself. I flipped through screenshots of emails where Vanessa referred to me as the frozen asset, mocking me for my silence. Daniel had let her believe I was a silent shareholder with no influence, a faceless source of funds. Even as he lay in my bed and kissed our daughter goodnight, he fed his mistress lies tailored to keep her power intact. But Nina's folder unraveled every deception. I didn't thank her with words, just a long, direct look that promised she was now protected. She understood and left without saying goodbye, her loyalty having finally found its rightful home. I opened my laptop again, dragging documents into a master folder titled Exit. It was time to compile every transfer, agreement, contract, and investor clause. If Daniel had made me invisible, then I would vanish, but on my terms, and I would take everything with me. That evening, Emma asked if her father would be attending her recital next week. I paused mid-chop, the knife hovering above a carrot, unsure how to answer. He said he might have meetings. I replied carefully, knowing he'd already planned a getaway with Vanessa to tour expansion venues. Emma frowned and shrugged, a small movement that carried an enormous weight. "It's okay," she said. "You always come." Those words reinforced my decision more than any betrayal could. Emma knew who stayed, who listened, who showed up, and that would be what mattered in the end. I kissed her forehead and stirred the soup, feeling the tide of the plan rising inside me. It was no longer about punishment. It was about correction. I wasn't destroying Daniel's empire. I was repossessing it. The next morning, Daniel brought me coffee, a rare gesture that almost made me laugh. He stood in his blue suit, beaming like he'd secured a new investor, and kissed my cheek as if we were still whole. "Big meeting today," he said. "Vanessa's presenting her strategy to the board." I smiled at him, thinking of the strategy I had built behind every slide Vanessa would present. "Good luck," I said sweetly, accepting the coffee he bought with money I'd earned. I waited until he left before logging into the final two accounts, Sterling Horizon Capital and Winterfield Investments. Both shell firms, both directed by me, both housing over $6.5 million in liquid capital. I verified the security keys, reviewed the terms, and began prepping withdrawal notifications. My fingers moved with surgical confidence, the muscle memory of a decade's worth of diligence. Every click echoed with the finality of justice. By noon, every document was ready: withdrawal letters, investor alerts, and regulatory compliance forms. I scheduled them to deploy simultaneously, staggered in 5-minute increments, beginning at 9 a.m. 2 days from now. The timing would coincide with Daniel's quarterly investor call, the one where he'd planned to announce a new round of expansion funding. It would be the perfect unveiling, a symphony of silence detonating under his arrogance. There was something poetic in the symmetry. That night, I didn't avoid Daniel. I sat next to him on the couch, pretending to watch a documentary while he responded to Vanessa's texts. His laughter was soft and private, as if he were in on a joke I'd never understand. But I understood everything now, and in 2 days, I would be the one smiling. Beside me, he adjusted his phone's brightness and leaned back like a man who believed the world adored him. When he fell asleep on the couch, I gently took his phone and confirmed the meeting with his real estate agent. Vanessa's name was on the application, and the deposit came from his discretionary bonus, the one I approved last fiscal year under trust guidance. He wasn't just replacing me emotionally, he was reallocating our wealth for her comfort. My hands didn't shake as I took screenshots and returned the phone to his chest. If anything, I felt lighter. The following day, I met Eleanor and Spencer at the Whitman estate. The three of us hadn't sat together like that since my father's funeral, and the gravity wasn't lost on any of us. "Everything is ready," Spencer confirmed, sliding over a stack of notarized authorizations. Eleanor reviewed them with her usual cool precision, nodding in approval. "Once this begins, Claire, there's no pause button." "I don't want a pause button," I said. "I want closure." The morning of the withdrawal, I woke before dawn and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee. Emma's lunch was already packed, her violin by the door, everything arranged with the same order I was about to dismantle in Daniel's world. The silence of the house felt different, not tense but final, like the stillness before a concert's first note. I glanced once at the countdown on my laptop screen. 8:57 a.m., 3 minutes until execution. Upstairs, Daniel's electric toothbrush buzzed faintly through the floorboards, his world still perfectly intact. Emma came down the stairs with her backpack slung over one shoulder, yawning and rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Did Dad already leave?" she asked, peeking into the hallway. "Not yet," I said, placing her lunch in her hands and kissing the top of her head. She hugged me tightly, sensing something under the surface but choosing not to ask. "Good luck at your meeting today," she said sweetly, still thinking I was just another executive wife. I watched her board the school bus, her silhouette small against the towering sunrise. When the door closed behind me, I turned to the screen. 8:59. 14 tabs sat open, one for each account, each containing a withdrawal letter and transfer authorization already signed and timestamped. At exactly 9 a.m., I clicked Send All, watching the confirmation icons ripple across the screen like falling dominoes. Within moments, emails began pinging in reply, automated confirmations, server receipts, alerts from bank compliance teams. Meridian Holdings' internal system would light up in red by 9:10 if it hadn't already. I knew their infrastructure. I'd helped design its early investor interface. The system would detect the first $8 million withdrawal from Whitman equity as a high-risk anomaly. By the time it registered the others, it would already be too late. I brewed another cup of coffee, slower this time, savoring the aroma like a ceremony. Upstairs, Daniel sang off-key in the shower, the sound ridiculous in the gravity of the moment. I smiled to myself, not with cruelty, but with certainty. Today wouldn't end with confrontation. It would end with understanding. He would finally see the woman he'd underestimated as the quiet architect behind his glass tower. At 9:12 a.m., Daniel's phone began ringing from the bathroom counter. It buzzed 3 times before going silent, only to buzz again immediately. I didn't need to see the caller ID to know it was Richard Crane. Another few seconds passed, and then came the sound of Daniel's feet pounding down the stairs, towel around his neck, phone pressed to his ear. "What do you mean, gone?" he snapped, pacing in front of the kitchen island. I sat quietly in the corner, sipping my coffee and pretending not to listen. His face paled, his jaw tightening as he registered each word spoken on the other end. "No, that's not possible. There's no way Claire could have." He stopped mid-sentence, suddenly aware of me sitting just 5 feet away. His voice cracked, then lowered. "I'll call you back." He stared at me like I was a stranger who had walked into his house without knocking. "Tell me you didn't do this," he said, breathless, voice hollow with disbelief. I set my mug down gently and looked at him without blinking. "You once told me it wasn't personal," I said softly. Turns out it always was. He moved closer, one step at a time, like he was approaching a wild animal. "Claire, this could ruin everything. There are deals in place, contracts pending, expansion projects already." I stood and cut him off with a hand raised. "Your expansion was built on borrowed time and inherited wealth. I simply reclaimed what was already mine." His eyes darted toward the living room as if expecting reinforcements to burst through the walls. "The board will never approve of this," he muttered. "They don't need to approve," I replied. "They only need to survive what's coming." Daniel blinked rapidly, sweat forming at his hairline. "I gave you everything," he said weakly, the words sounding more like a confession than a defense. "No," I corrected. "I gave you everything." For the first time, he didn't argue. He slumped against the wall, staring past me at the floor, silent, The empire he believed he built was crumbling in real time, and there was no PowerPoint or pitch deck to save him now. I left him there, still and stunned, and returned to my office to monitor the market response. Meridian Holdings, stock froze in pre-market trading by 9:30, flagged for unexplained asset fluctuations. The board was already scrambling to assemble an emergency call, but without Richard or Daniel able to explain the capital drain, panic spread like wildfire. Messages from mutual connections started flooding my phone. Polite inquiries, worried speculation, veiled threats. I responded to none. By 10 a.m., I had a voicemail from Vanessa. Her voice was brittle with fear masked by forced calm. "Claire, I know you're upset, but this feels excessive. Maybe we should talk." I deleted the message without listening to the rest. She hadn't earned the right to call me by name. At 11 a.m., Eleanor texted a single word, delivered. That meant the media packet had reached Meridian's board, outlining the truth of every dollar invested over the last 7 years. The package included full audit records, legal affidavits, and screenshots of Daniel's own acknowledgments of Whitman investments. Every lie Vanessa had been told about my insignificance was now rendered absurd. The woman she thought was a forgotten shareholder had just pulled the floor out from beneath her throne. I stepped out onto the back patio for air, the garden blooming behind me, as if untouched by the chaos unraveling in the financial world. Birds chirped, flowers opened to the sun, and my phone continued to vibrate with messages I had no intention of answering. Daniel sat inside, defeated and motionless, while I breathed in the scent of lavender and lemon balm. 7 years of silence, 7 years of sacrifice, 7 years of swallowing back the words I should have said. All of it had led to this morning. When I returned inside, Daniel had finally moved. He stood in front of the living room window, phone clutched in one hand, watching nothing in particular. "Vanessa's gone," he said without turning around. "She won't return my calls." I gave him nothing. No comfort, no pity. He had built his future on someone else's foundation and was shocked when the architect took the keys back. Daniel's silence lingered, like smoke in the air, long after he muttered Vanessa's name. I walked past him toward the kitchen, not offering a word, just the steady cadence of my footsteps on the hardwood floor. Behind me, I heard him shift, as if realizing he no longer controlled the room, the house, or the story. The dynamic had changed permanently, and he knew it deep in his bones. His empire was never his. It had always worn my family's signature in invisible ink. He followed me into the kitchen, hovering near the island like a ghost unsure where to exist. "Claire, what happens now?" he asked, his voice ragged and lower than I'd ever heard it. I turned to face him, still calm, still steady, and laid it out without cruelty. "You'll meet with the board at noon and resign as CEO." The weight of those words made him sway slightly, like a man who'd been hit in the chest. "I built that company," he whispered, more to himself than to me. I placed my coffee mug in the sink, the sound loud in the quiet. "And I built the company's bones," I replied. "You decorated the house I constructed." His hands opened and closed at his sides, searching for something to hold on to. Reason. Defense, a lie that still worked. His voice rose slightly, a tremor of old pride creeping in. "You don't understand the fallout, Claire. This affects real people. Jobs, partnerships, our reputation." I turned and crossed my arms, leaning back against the counter, eyes locked onto his. "You didn't consider those people when you promoted your mistress over your wife." That landed, hard and deep, and he flinched like I'd struck him. "You knew what she was to me," I added, my voice cold. Daniel collapsed into one of the bar stools, his elbows on the granite island, fingers rubbing his temples. I watched him for a moment, detached, the same way I'd once watched Emma's fever break after a terrifying night, concerned but calm, knowing the worst had passed. The difference was, this man's fever had only just begun. His empire would hemorrhage without my reinvestment, and he now had no leverage to ask for mercy. This wasn't revenge. This was repossession. At 11:30 a.m., Eleanor called to confirm the press statement was live. I opened the link and skimmed the headline. "Whitman Capital reclaims 58% stake in Meridian Holdings, cites ethical breach, executive misconduct." There was no mention of Daniel by name, No scandalous language, only the cold clarity of legal facts. My name appeared as the acting majority stakeholder and temporary board-appointed executive lead. For a woman Daniel once called uninvolved, I had suddenly become everything. Emma came home early from school, unaware of the shifting tectonic plates beneath our home. She dropped her backpack by the door and walked into the kitchen, spotting Daniel first. "Hey, Dad," she said casually, then glanced at me. "Are we still going to Nana Eleanor's this weekend?" I nodded and smiled, keeping her world stable even as mine redrew its borders. Daniel looked at Emma with a mixture of regret and fear, as though he realized he was no longer the father she would admire without question. "How was your day, sweetheart?" he asked, voice softer than usual. "Fine," she said, grabbing a yogurt from the fridge. "Some girls at school said something about your company being in the news, but I didn't really get it. I didn't speak." Daniel needed to answer that one himself. He looked at me, silently, asking for permission, and I offered none. "There were changes at work," he said carefully. "Some decisions I made had consequences." Emma, wise beyond her years, just nodded and peeled the lid off her yogurt. "Okay," she said, unconcerned for now, but the seed had been planted. I kissed her on the head and sent her upstairs to practice violin. Once she was gone, I turned back to Daniel. "You're going to the board meeting," I said. "You will resign. You will say it was your decision, and you will recommend my leadership transition in the interim." His face turned red, but he didn't object. "What if I don't?" he asked, a whisper of defiance clinging to his pride. I stepped closer, my voice low and precise. Then I released the full audit Nina compiled. The receipts from the Cartier watch, the hotel invoices from New York, the emails between you and Vanessa outlining your plan to restructure without board consent. His shoulders slumped, the fire gone. "You wouldn't." "I already have them," I interrupted. "They're in a folder titled Insurance, delivered to 3 media contacts with an embargo trigger." He sat back like a man defeated by his own arrogance. "Do you hate me?" he asked quietly, and I answered without hesitation. "No, I just stopped excusing you." At 12:01 p.m., Daniel entered the boardroom at Meridian Holdings and resigned in front of 12 men and women who had once applauded his every word. I watched from the corner of the room, silent and composed, my presence deliberate but not boastful. He read the statement I had written, voice strained, and when he got to the part where he named me as his recommended successor, he faltered. A beat of silence passed, and then he said it. "Claire Whitman, my wife, has been the unseen force behind our success." The board didn't clap. They only nodded, businesslike and grave, sensing that the change wasn't just necessary, it was overdue. Richard Crane stood to offer his support for my interim leadership, which passed unanimously in less than 5 minutes. Daniel left the room without looking back. I remained seated, the room quiet, the silence heavier than any applause. After the meeting, I walked the halls of Meridian as its new acting CEO. Employees whispered in corners, trying to understand the shift in power that had happened overnight. I didn't explain, didn't stop to clarify. I simply walked, the same woman I had been yesterday, but with authority finally visible. Nina met me outside my new office, her relief visible. "It's done," she said softly. "Yes," I replied, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Now we rebuild." By the following morning, my name had been added to the internal directory as interim CEO of Meridian Holdings. The staff newsletter, usually filled with fluff about team outings and stock performance, now opened with a formal note about executive transition. No details were given about Daniel's resignation, just that it was voluntary and effective immediately. I knew better than anyone how euphemisms worked in corporate settings, especially when they protected legacies built on illusions. Mine wouldn't be one of them. I held my first executive meeting at 10 a.m. in the same boardroom where Daniel had once announced Vanessa as the new face of strategy. The room smelled like lemon polish and tension, and I wore a gray tailored suit my mother had once worn to settle a shareholder dispute. Eleanor had texted me that morning. "Walk in with facts. Leave with silence. Power doesn't have to raise its voice." I didn't raise mine. I didn't need to. Richard Crane walked me through the current financial projections now that the Whitman funds had been pulled and restructured under direct control. His slides were straightforward. Meridian could survive, but only if we downsized aggressively and scrapped 3 of Daniel's expansion projects. I nodded, marking notes in my pad, letting the weight of each decision settle without flinching. No more vanity projects, I said quietly, glancing at a file labeled Singapore Initiative Phase 2. If it doesn't earn, it burns. No one challenged me, not because I intimidated them, but because I spoke with numbers instead of promises. Daniel had dazzled with charisma and future promises. I presented EBITDA margins and projected savings down to the decimal. The difference was felt immediately. For the first time in years, the boardroom wasn't filled with spectacle. It was filled with accountability. And it would stay that way. After the meeting, Nina handed me a sealed envelope with Vanessa's name printed in neat block letters. She came by security this morning trying to retrieve her things, Nina said, keeping her voice neutral. When she was stopped, she left this for you. I took it without a word and placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk, unopened. Whatever she had to say was already irrelevant. I walked the floor that afternoon, stopping at departments Daniel had rarely visited. The data team was buried in metrics for a failed Latin American rollout. The marketing team had been directionless since February, grasping for leadership. Several employees looked surprised to see me, as if expecting a ghost, not a living, breathing woman who knew their job titles by heart. I didn't introduce myself. I asked questions instead. What are you working on? I asked a young man named Marcus in IT. His voice wavered, but he quickly walked me through a network overhaul Daniel had delayed to fund Vanessa's analytics contract. I reviewed the numbers with him right there at his screen. Approve it, I said. You'll have what you need by Friday. He blinked at me like I'd handed him a miracle. Word traveled fast. By the end of the day, I'd received a handwritten thank you note from the facilities team and an email chain from legal outlining past concerns about Daniel's discretionary spending. Vanessa's name appeared repeatedly in those flagged reports, most of which had been buried before they reached the board. I opened a new folder titled Internal Oversight and began compiling everything. I wasn't cleaning up a mess. I was disinfecting a system. At home that night, Emma sat at the kitchen island doing math homework while I prepared dinner. "Is Dad still working at Meridian?" she asked, eyes fixed on the numbers in front of her. I considered the truth she deserved and how to deliver it gently. "Not anymore," I said. "He's taking some time off." She nodded slowly, then flipped the page in her notebook. "Did he do something bad?" she asked. "He made some bad choices." I said honestly, setting a bowl of roasted vegetables in front of her. "But we're going to be okay." She gave a small smile, but I saw her tuck that information away. She understood more than she let on. After she went to bed, I poured a glass of wine and finally opened Vanessa's letter. Her handwriting was neat, almost artificial in its perfection, like someone trying too hard to appear composed. "Claire," it began, "I never meant to come between you and Daniel. I truly believed he had separated from you emotionally long before I entered the picture." I paused, my expression unmoved. Her belief had never mattered. She went on to describe how Daniel had promised her equity in the company, a private villa, and even a place on the strategic board after the expansion. None of those promises had been fulfilled. She felt used, misled, and deeply embarrassed by how it all unraveled. "I hope you can forgive us both," she wrote in closing, "and I hope one day you'll understand that I, too, was manipulated." I folded the letter carefully and set it aside without a single emotional reaction. My phone vibrated with a new email from the legal team. Subject line: unauthorized bonuses. Daniel had routed nearly $400,000 in executive bonuses to consulting accounts connected to Vanessa, all within the last fiscal year. The funds had been masked under innovation incentives and required deeper audit approval. I forwarded the message to Spencer, attaching my own note. Proceed with recovery. Some debts required collection, not forgiveness. The next day, Daniel showed up at the house unannounced. He wore jeans and a wrinkled button-down, looking like a man who had just realized the world didn't revolve around him anymore. Emma wasn't home, thankfully at a school field trip, and I met him at the doorway with my arms crossed. "I just want to talk," he said, already pushing his way inside. 5 minutes, Claire. We sat in the living room where we once hosted game nights, baby showers, and quarterly fun dinners. You win, he said first, his voice hoarse. Meridian's yours. The board loves you. The media is hailing you as the silent genius. I said nothing, letting him sit with his own words. I've lost everything, Claire. My reputation, my home, my daughter's respect. You lost those things the moment you started lying, I said. This isn't about revenge, it's about correction. His head dropped into his hands, shoulders sagging like someone under real weight for the first time. I miss her, he mumbled, and I didn't have to ask who. He meant Vanessa, the woman who had left once the power vanished. I stayed longer than I should have, I said, because I believed the version of you who said we were building something together. He looked up, eyes glassy with unshed tears. Do you hate me now? I gave him the same answer I had before. No, I just stopped excusing you. Before I narrate what happens next, kindly let me know what city or country you're watching from and why you haven't subscribed yet. Daniel didn't respond to that final sentence. He simply sat there, blinking slowly like he was finally absorbing the consequences. I let the silence stretch between us, not out of cruelty, but because some truths deserve to echo. You should go, I said quietly, gesturing toward the door with a nod. His movements were slow, like a man underwater, dragging the weight of his decisions behind him. He opened the door, turned once, as if expecting me to stop him, and then stepped out without a word. When the door closed, I locked it, then double-checked it, more for symbolism than safety. I leaned my forehead against the wood, listening to his footsteps fade down the walkway. Behind me, the house felt calmer, as if it had exhaled a long-held breath. The air didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt mine. And for the first time in years, I realized I didn't feel lonely. The next morning, Emma came into my room while I was buttoning my blouse. Is Dad moving out? She asked, sitting cross-legged on the bed. I nodded and sat beside her, smoothing her hair behind her ear. Yes, sweetheart, but you'll still see him, and he'll always be your dad. She didn't cry, but her eyes were quiet in that way that told me she was storing everything for later. She helped me pick out my earrings, small gold hoops Eleanor had given me after my first investment approval. You look like a boss, she said, trying to smile. I kissed her forehead and thanked her, then grabbed my portfolio and briefcase. On the drive to school, she hummed to herself while looking out the window, and I reached over to squeeze her hand at a red light. She didn't squeeze back immediately, but by the next block she did. At the office, Nina met me with a stack of approvals and a soft smile. The restructuring plan passed, she said, holding up the board signatures. Congratulations, Madam CEO. I took the folder, flipping through the contracts and realignment memos, each one a monument to control reclaimed. It's not about the title, I murmured, mostly to myself. It's about the architecture. The phrase echoed in my mind as I entered my new office. Daniel's old office, now stripped of his ego and decorated with clean lines and clear intent. I'd removed his photos, his golf trophies, and his ridiculous framed quote about hustle that had never applied to him anyway. In their place were photos of my parents, a framed Wall Street Journal article about Eleanor's acquisition deal in 1993, and a crystal paperweight I'd found in a drawer labeled Claire, keep if he ever forgets. I didn't know which assistant had labeled it, but I kept it on my desk anyway. It felt like quiet vindication. The first order of business was signing off on the termination of all vanity consulting contracts, including the final remnants of Vanessa's firm. She had already received a cease and desist for breaching her NDA after an anonymous interview appeared online, hinting at toxic female-led takeovers. Legal handled it quickly, and I never needed to respond. My silence said more than any public statement could. She faded into irrelevance faster than I expected. By week's end, I'd hosted 2 all-staff meetings, implemented transparency protocols, and launched an employee performance review system that replaced Daniel's favoritism with merit-based progress. The mood inside Meridian shifted palpably, lighter, more focused, and, most importantly, functional. I sat in on meetings. Daniel had always skipped, answered questions without condescension, and walked floors he had ignored. Word traveled fast that I wasn't just a figurehead. I was rebuilding something meant to last. Richard Crane invited me to a quiet dinner to debrief on the first week of leadership. We met at a low-key restaurant just outside the city, where the staff knew him well and asked no questions. "You've done in 5 days what Daniel couldn't do in 5 quarters, he said, raising a glass of wine. I chuckled, swirling mine before replying. "That's because I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was just correcting a lie." We discussed numbers, capital allocation, and growth with sustainable roots, topics Daniel used to skim or hand off to Vanessa with buzzwords. "I've never seen the board this focused," Richard said, flipping open his tablet. "They're asking about long-term goals, not just profit spikes." I nodded, taking a sip. "That's because they finally know who's holding the foundation, and they would never forget again." Later that night, I returned home to find Emma asleep on the couch, her homework scattered around her like a paper fortress. I carried her to bed, tucking her in as she mumbled something about decimals and string instruments. In the dim hallway, I paused outside the guest room, Daniel's temporary space during his final nights at home. The door was cracked open, the bed untouched, the closet empty. His toothbrush was gone from the bathroom sink. I stood there for a while, letting the silence settle, feeling no need to fill it. There was no catharsis, no grand exhale, just peace. When I returned to my bedroom, I placed Emma's most recent drawing on my nightstand. It showed the two of us holding hands under a sun labeled, "My Mom is Bright." That picture meant more to me than any shareholder vote. The next morning, I woke to an alert from my legal team. Daniel had officially filed his resignation letter with public record, aligning with the transition documentation from last week. The media picked it up within the hour. Disgraced CEO Daniel Hunt resigns. Ex-wife and majority investor Claire Whitman appointed successor. I read the headline twice and then closed the tab. He wasn't disgraced in my eyes. He was simply revealed. Emma and I celebrated with pancakes, whipped cream, and strawberries, a Saturday tradition we had abandoned during Daniel's early strategy days. She told me her science teacher called her a natural leader during group work. "Like you," she said with a smile. I kissed her cheek and said, "No, sweetheart, better." At noon, Eleanor arrived at the house with 2 boxes, one containing old Whitman Trust archives, the other a bottle of rare wine. "You did it," she said as I opened the door. "You didn't just correct the narrative, you rewrote it." I poured us both a glass and toasted not to revenge, but to reclamation. The difference mattered. Eleanor and I sat on the back patio, the September wind lifting the edge of the linen tablecloth as we sipped our wine in comfortable silence. The garden around us bloomed late, like it had been waiting for the noise to pass before coming alive again. "What will you do next?" she asked finally, her tone neutral but curious. I stared into the glass, the dark red surface catching the light. "Stabilize first, then scale, with oversight this time," I said, keeping my voice even. She nodded, satisfied, then tapped the lid of the smaller box with one manicured finger. "Your grandmother kept records on paper for a reason," she said. "This box holds every strategic decision she made before digitization. She didn't trust systems. She trusted patterns." I opened the lid to reveal yellowed pages, margin notes in fountain pen, and faded clippings from business journals that predated my birth. There were notes on expansion timing, divestment schedules, and crisis contingency templates, all dated and referenced like she'd been building a roadmap. I traced my fingers along the spines of bound ledgers, awed by the intentionality of it all. "She'd have liked you," Eleanor murmured. "You would have terrified her," I replied with a smirk, earning a rare, genuine laugh from my mother. It felt like a turning point, not just for me, but for us. Emma came outside with a tray of tea cookies she'd baked herself, a little too golden on the bottom, but sweet in her pride. "For the Whitman women," she said, grinning, and Eleanor actually reached out to pull her into a brief hug. "You'll be next," she told Emma, and the words didn't land as pressure. They landed as promise. I watched my daughter's eyes brighten at the idea, not the expectation. That was how legacy should feel. Earned, not inherited. Later that evening, I checked my phone and found several missed calls from Daniel's number. I let them go to voicemail without hesitation, already guessing the tone would range from pleading to desperate. He was losing grip on whatever residual identity he thought he could salvage. and I had no intention of being his lifeline. I forwarded the call log to our legal team with a note: no response unless urgent. His emergency no longer dictated my peace. At the next board meeting, Richard presented the quarterly forecast with a clarity we hadn't seen in years. Our liquidity had stabilized, overhead was down by 19%, and investor confidence had recovered faster than expected. I kept my comments brief and focused, letting the numbers speak. When someone brought up Daniel's legacy in passing, I didn't flinch. I redirected the conversation to workforce morale metrics. The message was clear. The past was context, not a blueprint. After the meeting, Nina pulled me aside with a document I hadn't expected. His shares, she said quietly. He's trying to sell them privately. I skimmed the details, confirming the transaction trail through a boutique brokerage in Montreal. It was legal but sneaky, a last-ditch attempt at liquidation before full dissolution of influence. Block it, I said without raising my voice. Trigger the clause about internal approval on Class B transfers. Nina nodded and was already dialing legal before I finished the sentence. Daniel wouldn't leave with a war chest. He'd leave with consequences. Anything less would diminish what we'd rebuilt. 3 days later, his attorney reached out requesting a meeting. I agreed under strict conditions: neutral ground, 2 attorneys present, and no press leaks. We met in a glass-walled office, overlooking the harbor, the view calm, in contrast to the reason for our presence. Daniel looked older, shoulders hunched, hair more salt than pepper. "I'm not fighting you anymore," he said, not even trying to sound noble. "You're not in a position to," I replied calmly, glancing once at his lawyer, who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. "I want to settle," Daniel said. "What's left of my stake, my options, the NDA. I'll sign it all. I just don't want to be humiliated further." I almost pitied him, but pity had no role in this room. I let the attorneys hash out the terms, only stepping in to say, "Emma gets final say on visitation. I won't force her either way." Daniel flinched at that, but didn't argue. He signed the exit documents with the same hand that once held my waist in wedding photos, now shaking slightly as it inked the end. As he slid the pen across the table, he said, "You know, for a long time I thought I made you." I looked him squarely in the eye. "You just revealed me." That night, I returned home to find Emma curled up on the sofa with Eleanor's ancient ledgers, flipping through pages like she was decoding a treasure map. "You really used to handwrite interest projections?" she asked, wide-eyed. "And color-code investment risk with red ink?" I laughed and pulled her close. "We didn't have algorithms. We had instincts and better pens." Emma leaned into me and asked, "Do you think I could run something one day?" I didn't hesitate. "You already do, honey. Every choice I make is for you." She didn't smile this time. She nodded, absorbing it with the quiet responsibility of someone learning how to carry more. Over the weekend, Margaret flew in from Chicago and joined us for a private dinner. It was the first time the 3 of us, Eleanor, Margaret, and I, had sat together without legal documents, inheritance disputes, or family crises between us. We drank whiskey from crystal tumblers, the kind Eleanor usually reserved for foreign dignitaries. "You know," Margaret said, stirring the ice, "we're not the vengeful type, but we're excellent with consequences." Eleanor raised her glass and added, "And we always collect what's owed." We toasted not to revenge or power, but to legacy, the kind built brick by brick, not borrowed or stolen. The fire crackled in the background, while Emma practiced scales in the next room, her notes slightly off-key but strong. Margaret smiled at the sound. "That's the future," she said, "a little raw but entirely ours." I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The following Monday, I arrived at the Meridian headquarters just after sunrise, walking past the tall glass doors that once reflected Daniel's image more than mine. A fresh plaque outside read Claire Whitman, CEO, simple and unadorned, just the way I'd requested. Inside, the staff buzzed with renewed energy, the tense atmosphere of uncertainty slowly giving way to confidence. People made eye contact again, said good morning without checking who was watching. That was how I measured success now. In quiet cultural shifts, not just financials. Nina met me in my office with 2 updates. The Montreal share sale had been formally blocked, and Vanessa's firm had dissolved after its last remaining client terminated the contract. "She'll resurface somewhere," Nina said, handing me a list of names she'd applied under. "But she won't be allowed near finance for a while." I nodded, not out of satisfaction, but out of closure. "Let her reinvent herself," I replied. "She'll learn what building actually means." I spent the next 2 hours reviewing the final stages of our transition audit. Legal had wrapped their findings, finance had reconciled the executive discretionary funds, and HR had quietly restructured the executive suite. Gone were the shadow roles, the unofficial consultants, the floating bonuses Daniel used to hand out like favors. What remained was leaner, tighter, and, most importantly, transparent. The company was no longer a kingdom, it was a structure with walls that made sense. Richard Crane entered my office mid-morning holding a single sheet of paper. "Press is asking for a final quote," he said. "Not about Daniel, just about the story arc, how Meridian stabilized under new leadership." I read the draft quietly, then grabbed a pen and added one line at the bottom. "Real growth begins when illusions end." Richard smiled, nodded, and passed it to comms. I didn't need a headline. I just needed the truth to land. That afternoon, I attended a staff Q&A in the smaller conference center downstairs, standing beside the VP of Operations and the head of HR. We'd invited every department to submit anonymous questions over the last week. Questions that had once been ignored or deflected. "Will promotions now be based on actual merit?" one employee had written. "Yes," I said, without hesitation. "And if you ever think otherwise, I expect you to ask me directly." The room went quiet, not in discomfort, but in stunned disbelief that someone at the top had answered plainly. That silence shifted quickly into applause, small at first, then growing with momentum. I stood still and let it pass over me, not smiling, not soaking it in, just acknowledging the shift. This wasn't validation. It was accountability, and I planned to honor it. At home, Emma had built a miniature model of a solar-powered greenhouse for her science elective. "I wanted to show how energy can be stored and reused," she explained, carefully lifting a flap that revealed hidden compartments under her model's roof. I knelt beside her at the dining table, marveling at the tiny circuits and reflective foil she'd used. "You built this without a kit?" I asked, and she beamed. "From scratch, like you rebuilt Meridian." The comparison caught me off guard, not because it wasn't accurate, but because she'd noticed. She wasn't just watching me survive. She was learning how to lead. I reached for her hand and said, "Then let's make sure everything you build has a foundation you can trust." She nodded solemnly, as if accepting a baton passed invisibly between us. The next day, I signed off on the final amendment to the Whitman Family Trust, an adjustment ensuring no future capital could be accessed without majority female sign-off. "Consider it structural equity," Eleanor had said when drafting it with our legal counsel. It wasn't about excluding men. It was about ensuring the builders never went unseen again. Emma would be protected by architecture she'd never need to question. On Thursday, Daniel sent a box to the house, left at the door with no note. Inside were a few items: a photo album from our early years, the journal he kept during Emma's first year, and the watch I'd given him on our 5th anniversary. I sat at the dining table, turning pages of the album slowly, each image a frozen fragment of someone I barely recognized now. There was love once, but love couldn't excuse erasure. I placed the watch in a drawer, tucked the journal into a box for Emma someday, and left the photo album closed. Some memories weren't meant to be erased, just filed away. The next day, Margaret called from Chicago. "I've been asked to speak at a law symposium about systemic power restructuring," she said. "They want case studies, and I'd like to use you." I paused, then smiled. "Use the company, not me. The story is bigger than either of us." Emma started asking to come to Meridian on the weekends, not for time together, but to study how people move in a company. She carried a notebook with her, recording observations like a young strategist in training. "Why does everyone look at you when they speak?" she asked once during a staff meeting. "Because I listen," I said. "That's rarer than most people think." Her eyes lit up like she'd uncovered a secret. By month's end, Meridian had not only stabilized, it had started to expand again. We hired 2 new women in executive leadership roles, rebuilt the data analytics team, and launched an internship program through the local business school. I made it policy that every intern would have a 30-minute conversation with someone in senior leadership. Access wouldn't be something people had to fight for anymore. Gatekeeping had expired, along with Daniel's reign. That weekend, Eleanor, Margaret, Emma, and I returned to the Whitman estate for a private garden dinner. It was the first time in decades that 4 generations of women had gathered there, with no men steering the conversation. The garden had been overgrown during the chaos, but now it was tended, pruned, purposeful. "Like the company," Emma said, brushing her fingers over a trimmed rose bush. We pulled out the weeds. I sat back in my chair, warm breeze against my face, and realized I felt something I hadn't in years. Ease. Not because the work was done, but because the work was now mine to choose. Emma leaned her head on my shoulder as the stars appeared overhead. "Are you going to write a book someday?" she asked. "No," I said, "but maybe you will." 3 weeks after Daniel's official departure, I received a certified letter from his attorney requesting a formal custody agreement for Emma. It wasn't aggressive. It simply proposed bi-weekly visits and alternating holidays, a standard arrangement dressed in polite language. I read the letter twice, then forwarded it to my own attorney, making clear that Emma's voice would come first. That evening, I sat her down at the kitchen table with a bowl of her favorite mint chip ice cream. "Your dad wants to spend more time with you," I said gently, and waited for her to respond. She stirred the ice cream without tasting it, then looked up. "I want to see him," she said, "but only if it's not weird." I smiled softly and nodded. "That's fair." There was no need to dig deeper. She was already wise enough to define her own boundaries. The next Sunday, Daniel picked her up at the curb while I watched from the porch, arms folded loosely, expression unreadable. He didn't ask to come inside, and I didn't offer. Emma hugged me before getting in the car, then glanced back once, her eyes searching my face for reassurance. I waved with a calm smile, projecting steadiness even if my chest felt hollow. She deserved a version of her father she could trust again, even if I no longer could. I spent those hours alone, cleaning out the last of Daniel's things from the garage. Old tennis rackets, forgotten tech gear, a stack of untouched woodworking tools he'd ordered during a brief, handy phase. Most of it went into donation boxes, but one bin held drawings Emma had made for him. Scribbles from her toddler years, construction paper hearts, a crayon sketch of the 3 of us under a tree. I saved those. They didn't belong to him anymore. They belonged to her story, and someday she'd decide what to do with them. When Emma returned later that afternoon, she seemed quiet, but not upset. "We got tacos," she said, toeing off her shoes. "He asked if I wanted to come to his new place next time." I crouched beside her and nodded. "You can, if you're comfortable." She met my eyes with a long, thoughtful look. I told him I'd think about it. At Meridian, the changes we'd made were starting to show real returns. Investor confidence had stabilized beyond projection, 2 strategic partnerships had been initiated, and our mentorship program had over 100 applicants in just 3 weeks. Richard sent a quarterly projection report with a simple post-it. "You built this." I read every line, every bar graph, every trend line. Knowing the numbers represented people, not just profit. There was pride in that, not ego, just earned purpose. That Friday, we hosted our first internal leadership summit since the transition. The event was small, just 60 team leads and execs, but the energy was electric. Instead of speeches, we held open strategy sessions, peer-led workshops, and even a lessons learned roundtable, where I shared exactly how Meridian had almost collapsed. I spoke plainly, naming the mistakes, the oversight, the culture that had enabled blind spots. No one flinched. They leaned in. During one of the breaks, a young manager named Janine approached me near the coffee station. "I hope this doesn't sound strange," she said, "but I applied here 3 years ago and turned down the offer because the leadership felt hollow." I sipped my coffee and raised a brow. "And now?" She smiled. "Now I'd fight to stay." That was the kind of retention metric you didn't find in spreadsheets. That weekend, Eleanor invited me and Emma to the estate for a private brunch in the conservatory. It had been renovated since our last visit. Sleek glass walls now encased the room, giving it a greenhouse glow. "A little transparency goes a long way," Eleanor quipped, pouring Emma a glass of sparkling lemonade. Emma giggled, loving the grown-up feel of clinking glasses with ice cubes. "Is this where you made all the big decisions?" she asked, wide-eyed. Eleanor nodded. "This is where we planned, pivoted, and occasionally plotted." I chuckled, watching Emma soak in every word like it was a bedtime story. "One day," Eleanor continued, "you'll bring your daughter here, or your niece, or your mentee, and you'll tell her how we didn't just survive betrayal, we transformed it." I reached for Emma's hand under the table and gave it a small squeeze. That night, back home, Emma stood in the doorway of my study, holding a sheet of notebook paper. "I wrote something," she said. "Can I read it to you?" I nodded and patted the couch beside me. She unfolded the paper, took a deep breath, and began. "My mom used to be someone people ignored, but she didn't get mad. She got stronger." My throat tightened, but I didn't interrupt. She didn't yell. She fixed the things that were broken, even if she didn't break them. Emma looked up briefly to make sure I was listening, then kept going. "Now, everyone knows who she is, but I always knew." I pulled her into my arms, holding her close, her heartbeat steady against mine. The next morning, Nina texted me a link to an op-ed in Forbes titled, "The Power of the Silent Architect, How Claire Whitman Rebuilt from Within." I skimmed the article quickly. Quotes from former employees, business analysts, even Richard. It praised the transition not as a revenge arc, but as a case study in reclamation. I closed the tab before reaching the end. I didn't need public approval. I already had the one audience that mattered. That afternoon, Daniel texted to ask if he could bring Emma to her violin recital the following weekend. I said yes, with clear boundaries. No last-minute cancellations, no appearances with new companions, and absolutely no press access. He agreed without protest, maybe finally understanding the difference between being a father and being seen. At work, I began drafting a 5-year vision plan, not just for Meridian, but for the mentorship initiative we'd quietly begun calling the Whitman Project. Its goal was simple: elevate women into leadership roles without apology, without delay, and without relying on inherited privilege. I reviewed candidate profiles from our first cohort, dozens of talented women who had been passed over for years under previous leadership. No more shadows. We were bringing them into the light. The morning of Emma's recital arrived crisp and clear, with golden autumn light pouring through the kitchen window. She wore a navy blue dress with a satin ribbon, her violin case swinging gently in her hand. "Dad said he'll be there," she said, eyes flicking to mine for any sign of hesitation. I smiled, smoothing a strand of her hair behind her ear. "I'm sure he will be, and we'll be in the front row." The recital was held in a modest auditorium at her school, filled with folding chairs and the hum of last-minute tuning. I sat beside Eleanor and Margaret, who both insisted on attending, each holding a small bouquet of tulips for afterward. Daniel arrived 5 minutes before the performance began, slipping into a seat near the back. He didn't wave, didn't try to draw attention, just watched, quiet and unsure. I saw Emma glance toward him once, then focus on the stage with purpose. When her turn came, she played Meditation from Thais, every note clean, lingering, and full of control. It wasn't flawless, but it was bold, steady, and uniquely hers. I felt tears prick behind my eyes, not because of pride alone, but because of what she had overcome to stand there so composed. When the final note faded, she bowed, and the room erupted into applause. Daniel clapped too, slower than most, like he was realizing something had passed him by. Afterward, Emma accepted her flowers with a shy smile and took pictures with her classmates. She walked over to Daniel on her own, hugging him briefly before returning to my side. "He said I played like a leader," she whispered. I crouched to her level, held her chin gently, and said, "You played like yourself, and that's more powerful than anything." She smiled fully this time, the kind that reached her eyes. Later that evening, we returned home, the house filled with the sound of Emma humming her piece while reheating leftover pizza. I stood in the kitchen, still in my heels, watching her move with casual confidence. She no longer needed reassurance. She was learning to be sure of herself, even when the room shifted. That was the true inheritance I wanted to leave her. Not wealth or business. Clarity. Upstairs in my study, I opened the final draft of the Whitman project's 5-year charter. The vision was clear. Create structures that didn't just include women, but depended on them. Not performative change, not token seats at the table, foundational influence. Emma's drawing from months ago, the one of the 3 of us under the sun, still sat in a small frame on my bookshelf. I'd kept it to remind myself how far we'd come. The board approved the charter unanimously the following week. 2 new partnerships with women-led incubators were announced, along with a restructured maternity policy that finally reflected real family balance. Our story was no longer about recovery. It was about reconstruction, and Meridian's reputation, once tethered to Daniel's ambition, was now anchored in quiet reform. The press stopped asking about the scandal because the success had become louder than the betrayal. Daniel sent a thank you card through legal channels the day his share transfer finalized. It was handwritten, short, and devoid of blame. "Thank you for not humiliating me when you had every reason to," it read. "I didn't understand what I was standing on, now I do." I filed it away in the locked drawer with Vanessa's letter and Caroline's old folder, documents from a chapter that no longer defined the ending. Emma continued to flourish. She started a blog about renewable science projects and joined a Girls in STEM club Eleanor helped sponsor. On weekends, she and I worked together on building a rain collection system for our garden, complete with a filtration component she designed herself. "This isn't about revenge, right?" she asked one day, adjusting the pipe angle under my supervision. I looked up at her, gloves covered in dirt. "No, sweetheart. It's about roots." Margaret visited more often. Her sharp courtroom instincts now turned toward mentoring younger female attorneys. "It feels different now," she told me over dinner, "like we finally stopped making exceptions and started setting precedents." Eleanor agreed, sipping from her wine glass. "The Whitman legacy isn't just intact, it's visible." I nodded, letting their words settle without the need to respond. In my office, 2 framed items sat side by side: Emma's music program from the recital and a new certificate awarded to Meridian by the Women in Finance Alliance. The latter read Corporate Reclamation and Structural Integrity Achievement, a mouthful of praise disguised as policy. I preferred Emma's program. Her name was in bold, with a star drawn beside it in blue ink. That was the future, not the plaque. News spread slowly but steadily that Daniel had relocated to Seattle, consulting part-time for a logistics firm with no ties to investment banking. He'd disappeared from social media, deactivated his LinkedIn, and begun rebuilding quietly. I didn't feel anger when I heard, just detachment, like a story I'd once read but no longer reread. Some endings don't need closure, they just need to stop repeating. The Whitman estate became a quarterly retreat site for the project, hosting strategy weekends and intergenerational mentor sessions. Emma often helped with setup, making name tags and welcoming guests at the gate. "I like hearing their stories," she told me after one weekend. "Everyone has something they came back from." I kissed the top of her head. "And now they're building forward." One morning, months later, I found a letter on my desk in Emma's handwriting. "To future me," it began. "Remember when you thought silence meant weakness? It doesn't. It just means you're storing your strength." I placed the letter in the same drawer where I kept the others, but this one didn't get locked. Meridian's valuation climbed beyond its previous peak within the year, but that wasn't the metric I kept framed. Instead, I hung a quote in the lobby, etched in glass behind the reception desk. "Power built on silence doesn't last. Power built by silence remembered does." Beneath it, a small plaque, "Claire Whitman, CEO." On our front porch that evening, Emma sat beside me, under a blanket, as twilight painted the sky soft gold. "Did you ever think you'd be in charge of a company like that?" she asked. I shook my head. "I thought I'd always be behind the scenes." She leaned her head on my shoulder. "Then I'm glad you stepped into the light." I kissed her temple and watched the stars begin to prick the sky. Fortune, our golden retriever, padded onto the porch and curled at our feet, her soft breath rising and falling with contentment. Behind us, the house was warm, steady, filled with laughter and order, and nothing left unspoken. Emma closed her eyes. I looked at her and knew this wasn't the ending. This was the legacy beginning. Thank you for listening to Claire's story. If you're yet to subscribe, please consider doing so before watching another story on the channel.